Let's kick off the webinar. Tonight, we are thankful to have Brian Leo and Brandon Monk with us to talk deer management and chronic wasting disease. So thankful for you guys. Thanks for your prep work and for the hours that you spent preparing for this webinar. I'm looking forward to it, and so is the public. So Brian, why don't you go ahead and take it away? The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Eric. So I'll just briefly introduce myself here. I'm Brian Leo, the statewide deer coordinator at California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm relatively new to the department, been working here for about 15 months. Prior to this job, I worked for 5 years as a game manager of an ungulate and game bird hunting program for the U.S. Army on the Big Island in Hawaii. I've got a master's degree and bachelor's degree in wildlife science, and I've been working in this field for about 18 years. And I'm also a hunter. I started hunting whitetail in upstate New York with my family as a teenager, but I've since branched out to different species and different methods of hunting. So that's just to say that, I work this job as both a biologist and a hunter, and so do many of the regional biologists that I work with around the state, and we try to use both of those perspectives as a manager in the deer program. So the deer program is part of the big game unit in CDFW. It plays a key role in upholding Section 1801 of the California Fish and Game Code, which requires the department to preserve, protect, and conserve wildlife. This mandate ensures that wildlife populations remain sustainable while promoting public education, the recreational use and enjoyment of those resources. To support the sustainable use of deer populations, particularly through hunting, the deer program focuses on several things: population monitoring and research, habitat preservation and management, regulation and enforcement, public education and outreach, and of course, the implementation and administration of hunts and health and disease management. So today our focus is going to be mostly on the health and disease management component. But before we get into that, I'd like to dive into a little bit of some of our current deer management initiatives. So for the population monitoring portion, we do have an extensive monitoring program and employ a variety of methods to collect information on deer populations. To estimate abundance, our most widely applied method uses fecal DNA, especially in forested habitats where aerial surveys aren't feasible. So we use molecular genetic techniques to allow for the individual identification of deer from epithelial cells on the surfaces of deer fecal pellets. And the surveys themselves involve collecting fecal pellets along approximately 1.2 kilometer transects and deploying camera traps to collect information on age and sex ratios. We then use these data in a spatial capture-recapture modeling framework to estimate density. And the combined modeling of the fecal DNA data, the camera traps, and GPS telemetry allow us to obtain deer population size estimates for does, bucks, and fawns. And so we're currently trying to scale this method up to the entire state to fill in some data gaps. On this map, you can see the blue dots represent transects that we've done in the past and from 2015 to 2023, totaling about 750 transects. And the red dots represent transects that are either currently being surveyed or plan to be surveyed in the future. So all these data will be used in a statewide integrated population model that we're currently developing. And that work will be a major component in a forthcoming statewide deer management plan, which is expected to be complete this summer. So we also conduct aerial surveys for deer. We recently completed surveys in Hunt Zone X3B in Northeast California and Modoc County this July. Typically, aerial surveys are completed in the winter when deer are in more open habitats. But this work was conducted this summer as a pilot project to test a different class of models referred to as hierarchical distance sampling. And this type of modeling can account for deer being unavailable for counting especially in dense and mixed cover types. So we also monitor deer using GPS collars, which I briefly mentioned earlier. Data collected through GPS telemetry allow us to conduct inference on things like deer resource selection, home range, and migration, and survival. These data are also used to improve the connectivity of populations that have been fragmented by roads and other infrastructure. So from about 2014 to 2023, we've deployed around 2,500 collars on deer throughout the state. So for habitat preservation work, we've been focusing on updating our statewide action plan for implementing Secretarial Order 3362, which directs agencies within the Department of the Interior, like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, to work in close partnership with us to identify, enhance, and improve the quality of big game winter range habitats and also migration corridors on the Department of Interior lands. So by promoting habitat preservation and management, this order aims to ensure the long-term sustainability of deer populations and the health of ecosystems. So past collaborations with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation have resulted in funding for mule deer research throughout California. So there's been previous work in Mono County on 395 and Loyalton, Truckee, and Doyle herds in the Northeast Sierra. So in our state action plan, we're working to identify parts of Lassen and Modoc counties to include as priority areas to improve deer winter range habitat. And we'll be mostly focusing on invasive juniper removal, as junipers tend to outcompete native vegetation and reduce the availability and shelter, reduce forage availability and shelter that deer rely on during harsh winter conditions. So the big game unit also plays a key role in proposing and recommending Title 14 regulation changes to the California Fish and Game Commission. These changes can include establishing hunting seasons, modifying quotas, implementing permit systems, or updating language. The process can take up to 14 months and involves two meetings with the Fish and Game Commission Wildlife Resources Committee, 3 commission meetings, including a notice of regulation change, a public comment period, a discussion meeting, and a final adoption meeting. So this year, potential changes that we're looking at include adding a late season D-zone buck hunt and modifying some hunt zone boundaries. And also this year, we worked quickly to pass an emergency regulation mandating the sampling of deer harvested in established chronic wasting disease management zones. And that kind of leads us into our health and disease management component of our deer program. And at this point, I'll hand it off to Brandon Monk, our lead veterinarian at CDFW's Wildlife Health Lab, and also our chronic wasting disease expert.
Thank you very much, Brian. Excited to be here tonight with you all. My name's Brandon. I am our state's senior veterinarian for big game species. I've been a wildlife veterinarian for about 12 years now, and I've been working on CWD in one capacity or another for each and every one of those 12 years. My professional mission is really, and it's what guides me day to day in my work, is to promote and protect and maintain healthy wildlife populations, and ideally through evidence-based research and management. I'm also a big game hunter, and I understand both the vital role hunters play in conservation and the sometimes opposing rules and regulations that agencies can roll out. There are always reasons for those regulations, and some might not be completely obvious. But tonight we're here to talk about chronic wasting disease, at least in part. And I will usually refer to it just as CWD. Sometimes I might refer to it as wasting disease. So CWD was detected in free-ranging deer and elk in Colorado the first time in the 1980s. And since then has continued to spread across North America and in South Korea and in Scandinavia. CWD remains one of the top concerns for deer and elk managers, biologists, and hunters. And we recently detected it in California for the first time. And just this month, Washington has reported CWD for the first time in their state as well. It's probably just a matter of time before it's detected in Oregon, Nevada, Arizona, and the handful of other states in the East that haven't detected it yet. I do want to go into some details about our recent detections this year, and we confirmed it was in California on May 6th, 2024. And I'm sure some of you have already noticed this or noted previously that these dates are pretty far apart. So the first animal died in September of 2023. This was a routine mortality investigation. So it was an older buck that was found dead on the landscape in a residential area. At the time, the biologist did a field necropsy, which is just basically an autopsy for an animal. And there was a few reasons why the animal had likely died. So the sample itself wasn't a high CWD risk sample. But part of the reason why we do opportunistic sampling and testing of mortalities like this is because you never know till you look. And by the time we got that sample from our field biologist in late February 2024, a couple weeks after the Bishop animal was struck by a vehicle and found dead and also sampled. Those samples come to our lab in Rancho Cordova, where we process the samples and then we send them off to our diagnostic lab that we use in Washington. Currently, there is not a diagnostic lab in California that does CWD testing. I hope to change that in the next few years, but these things do take time. And I highlight that for a couple of reasons. One, I do want folks to be aware that it does take time for this testing to be done and completed. And right now we're sitting right around 3 or 4 weeks average time. And we're trying to keep that as low as possible. But to get samples from the field processed to our lab in Washington and results back from them, it does take time. I also like to highlight a couple things here. These two detections are in deer in two very different populations, and they're separated by a whole lot of country, including the Sierra Crest. We've got some examples of our collar information or our collar data from deer herds in these areas. And there is overlap in the migratory deer herds along the Sierra Crest. So it is very likely that there's interaction between deer on the east side and deer on the west side of the Sierra Crest. The Western Slope deer was as I mentioned, found dead in a residential area in Yosemite Lakes Park in Madera County. And that population of deer is mostly resident. So they're deer that are there year round, neighborhood deer. And it's a pretty dense population, artificially dense population. There's a refugia from partial refugia from predation, and usually a whole lot of food resources and water resources available that might not be available outside of the residential area. Contrast that with the deer that was positive from the Bishop area, and that was almost certainly from a migratory herd, and a herd that is not nearly as densely populated as that Yosemite Lakes herd. And our next steps are going to be to find out more about how much we have and where it's at in those areas. And I'll talk a little bit about that in some later slides. But a common question we have is, what does CWD look like in a deer? And frankly, a prime-aged buck is what the vast majority of CWD positive deer look like, where CWD occurs and has been for a long time. And we know this through the decades of surveillance and sampling done in Colorado and Wyoming. And this is likely due to a couple things. One, the disease progression is extremely slow. From the day that a deer is exposed to CWD prions, it's about 15 or more months before that animal starts showing clinical signs. Couple that with male behavior. They're moving around a lot more. They're coming in contact with a lot more different groups. There are, particularly in the rutting season, they're fighting each other. There's a lot more opportunities for those deer to be exposed. Combine those, and that's probably why we see a higher prevalence in this population of male deer, this prime age buck. Now, when you get further along in the clinical progression, more towards the end stage, more towards that 15+ months, animals do start to develop overt, obvious clinical signs. That's this progressive weight loss, or the wasting that chronic wasting disease gets its name from. It's the hallmark of this disease. That symptom and none of the other symptoms are the only symptom, or are only attributable to CWD. They're common findings in most chronic diseases, or at least in a lot of chronic diseases that we see in CWD. So it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to look at an animal and say that animal has CWD. And I point that out because I've heard in my career, oh, I can tell that this animal has CWD by X, Y, and Z. I can tell that it has CWD by looking at the liver. You can't. The only way we can tell it has CWD is by taking samples and testing them in the lab. I do like this picture because it does show a couple other things. You should be able to see there's a bunch of wetness along the chin of this deer. This deer was just drinking in this watering hole. Excessive salivation, increased drinking, increased urination. Those are clinical signs of CWD as well. It's also routes that the infectious prion can get into the environment through saliva, through urine. And then we see behavioral changes. This animal is alone, decreased social interactions, loss of awareness, and fear. And then one aspect of this picture that really highlights some of the management challenges. If you look behind, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, there's at least 5 eye shines back there. These are deer that are following this animal at a distance to this watering hole. And the infectious prions are extremely robust in the environment. They can persist in the environment for years, potentially decades, and remain infectious. It's a very small infectious dose. Excretion of the infectious material is in saliva, urine, feces. Guarantee you this deer urinated in or near this watering hole. So it's very likely that all these deer following this CWD positive animal are now exposed to CWD and are likely to develop CWD later in life. So what is CDFW doing? Well, our initial first response action item for following a detection was outreach, 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 outreach. We're still doing that. That's one of the reasons why we're here tonight. We've spent an awful lot of our time trying to update our website, have conversations with our Fish and Game Commission, both the Wildlife Resource Committee and the Commission at large. Conversations with hunter conservation groups, hunter ed webinars, and really any avenue that we can provide information. We've been trying to do that as best we can. The next step, and this is where some of the emergency regulations y'all may have heard of and that we're going to talk about a little bit come in, is we really need to know how much we have and where it's at. And the only way we can do that is through increased sampling. So the Fish and Game Commission in July adopted emergency regulations, and just want to point out the emergency part of the emergency regulations is more of highlight a faster administrative route to developing short-term regulations that can either sunset within 6 months or be adopted for full as a full regulations package. It's less the sky's on fire, emergency. It's more of administrative procedure. But what we did with those regulations is we defined a CWD management zone, and we defined it very specifically: D7, X9A, X9B, and X9C. The Madera, the Western Slope positive, was firmly in D7. That was a no-brainer. The Bishop positive was from the Bishop area, and that's at a confluence of all three of those X9 hunt zones. Because of what we know about CWD, because the progression is so slow, because deer interact with each other, the expectation is that if there's one deer in that area or near that area, there's likely more deer in and near that area. So we wanted to call all three of those X9 zones a management zone so we can get more samples. And then the mandatory sampling of deer harvested within those 4 zones. And that's how we're gonna get a better idea of how much we have and where it's at. And the reason we need to know that is because that's gonna guide our recommendations moving forward for management. And I can't stress this enough. We can't successfully manage CWD without help from hunters. Hunter participation is vital, and that's both within CWD sampling and testing. The vast majority, about 85% of our samples over the last 25 years have come from hunter harvest. I expect now that we're doing a bit of a full court press, I expect that percentage to even go up, probably closer to 90–95%. So we very much recommend you get your harvest tested. And if you're in those 4 CWD management zones, that sampling is mandatory. Another avenue hunters can help is by reporting clinical animals. As a group, you all probably spend more time out looking at deer and noting their condition than probably any other single group in California. And so that's a vital resource for us. And we have an online mortality reporting system, CDFW mortality reporting, where you can log in a online form, and that sends us an email with the report. And if it's concerning, we can send that report out to a field biologist and request that they look into it and potentially get a sample from that animal. All of our sampling currently is done on post-mortem animals, so we do need a carcass to be able to sample and test. Hunters are also vital for helping prevent the spread by following best practices, and that comes down to carcass management, carcass handling. We don't want to be moving the most infectious materials around the landscape. And then a lot of our regulations, our import regulations and carcass handling regulations are focused on decreasing that movement of infectious materials. And then through CWD management, a large part of our management, if not most of our management of chronic wasting disease in our deer and elk herds, is probably going to be through harvest. And that may mean more hunting opportunities in some places. There's a chance that could mean less hunting opportunities in some places, but we can't say that, can't know what we're gonna recommend without better sampling and testing throughout the state. So I did talk a lot about this, and right now this is probably the most vital and important way hunters can immediately participate in our CWD management. It is get your harvest sampled and tested. And there's 3 ways to do that. And if I can figure out how to do this, I will navigate our website a little bit here. There we go. So this is our main landing page. There's an awful lot of information. We have a link to our emergency regulations here, if you want to read what we proposed and what was adopted. This right here will bring you to a map dashboard with more information than you probably ever wanted on where we have CWD, where we've detected CWD currently, all of our historic surveillance, sampling, and testing that we've done. And it's being slow tonight. Apologies. These red zones are our management zones. These dots are the 2 detections. As we get more detections, we will update this. And this information will be available for folks online or on through our website. You can also click on each of these hunt zones, and it'll tell you how many animals we've sampled and tested in that zone since 2000. And then this link right here just takes you down to the 3 ways you can get your animal sampled and tested: CDFW offices, participating meat processors or taxidermists, collect and submit samples on your own. Once you've submitted a sample, expect 2 to 4 weeks, probably right around 4 weeks before results are available. And you can enter your tag number here and search it, and it'll, no record were found for this one, but it'll spit back the report once we have it. I do encourage everybody to look at these websites. We have a map here. This is very similar for the meat processor and taxidermist. Click on these, it tells you where our sampling station is, when it's open. We also have a downloadable PDF here with our sampler locations and when they're open. Same thing for the meat processors tab. And then I just want to show one last thing here. If you're interested in collecting your own sample, or if you're going to be doing some backcountry hunting, this is a great opportunity, a great way to still be able to sample your animal and not have to pack out a whole bunch of stuff. There's a video how-to. It's not difficult, but it sometimes can be difficult to find the right tissues. And then there's also printable instructions here that go through the process of sampling that we recommend. Okay.
Outstanding, Brandon.
What was that?
I said outstanding work. Go ahead.
Thank you. So real quickly, the sampling does involve a cut through the hide. So if so I want to show you folks that so you know what to expect. It's right behind the widest part of the trachea, that kind of our Adam's apple. Cut through the windpipe, pull back and cut back towards the base of the ears. And then the lymph nodes will be on either side of midline here. And you might need to use your finger a little bit to expose them, but they should pop out. They should feel different than other parts of the animal. So you can get your animal sampled and still maintain a head and shoulder mount. Best way to do that is have a taxidermist cape it out and sample it for you. Visit that website to see which participating taxidermist might be near you and willing to do that. Other options, cape it out yourself and then bring it to one of our sampling stations or an office, and one of our staff can sample it. We will not be skinning or caping harvests for hunters. We just don't want to potentially nick a trophy mount. Also consider European or just antler mounts as an alternative. Best practices for carcass handling: the highest risk parts, the parts where CWD prions are going to be at the highest density and highest concentration, are going to be the lymph nodes, and the lymph nodes are all over the place. The guts, so field dressing, leave that gut pile at the harvest site, and then the brain, spinal cord. Also eyes and optic nerves, but much lower than the rest. So our best recommendation for carcass handling is transport out only meat and antlers. Leave the rest at the site of the harvest. That means you have to self-sample your deer. That may not be feasible for everyone. So if you can quarter your harvest out, bring that out along with the head, bring the head to a sampling station or a meat processor or a taxidermist. And then after that, dispose of the remains, whatever you're not going to packaged for meat in a landfill that accepts animal carcasses. I just want to know, if we do get a detection from a hunter harvest, one of the first people that is going to know about it, besides me, is going to be the hunter themselves. So we'll be trying to track down a phone number. We'll be trying to track down some kind of contact for the hunter, and we'll let them know that their harvest is positive if there is a detection in a hunter harvest. So far, there hasn't been any, but it's quite possible. And at that time, if the hunter wants to relinquish any remains, any of the meat, currently CDFW will accept that, and we can take that and incinerate it for the hunter free of charge. But that is totally voluntary for the hunter. Question that we often get: can we eat our deer if it's positive? The hunter must. It's really up to the hunter to decide for themselves what you're comfortable with. There's currently no evidence that CWD has or can affect people. Some really good studies have shown that it may not even be physically possible. But we do have evidence from bovine spongiform encephalopathy or mad cow disease that does suggest that at least some animal prion diseases may be able to jump from animal to human. Never been shown with CWD, never been shown with sheep scrapie, but because of that mad cow, most of us recommend a cautious approach and recommend the precautionary principle and to have your animal tested. And if it does test positive, not to consume anything from that animal. The concern managers have and hunters have alike is, as chronic wasting disease persists in a population and prevalence of chronic wasting disease gets high, we can see and probably will see an effect on populations, and we'll see a decline. It's not always the only cause of decline. Sometimes it's a compensatory cause. But once CWD does get above some high threshold of prevalence, and that threshold is dependent on the population it's in question, we can see decline. So our management goal is going to be to prevent CWD where it doesn't occur, and to keep CWD below that threshold, whatever that may be for the population. Also, we do expect there to be economic costs both to hunters and to the management agencies. States with CWD spend about 8 times more on CWD management than states that don't have CWD. And as such, our management plan, as I mentioned, is really focused on detecting CWD, identifying how much we have, where it's at, and then instituting management actions to either maintain prevalence if it's already low, decrease prevalence if it's high, and reduce the likelihood of spreading it to naive populations. And ultimately, that's my job as a wildlife veterinarian is to protect and manage our deer populations for health in perpetuity, but also for hunting opportunities in perpetuity. And our management plan is really focused on that as well. And this is freely available on our website. We just got it signed off by leadership, and it's available for folks to read through. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Well done, Brandon. Thanks so much for spending time with us and doing such a thorough explanation. And thanks also for the panelists that have stuck around. And I know you've been super busy typing away. So I've got a few questions for you, and we're kind of going to bounce between Brian and Brandon on these. And we'll start with you, Brian, on the management side. And first question is, when will the state reopen mountain lion hunting? And this person says he sees multiple cats a year on camera and in person.
I can take that one if you'd like.
Sure, Mario, you can go ahead.
So mountain lion hunting is something that is outside of the purview of the department, to a certain degree, unfortunately. And it's something that we require a legislative change in order for us to do mountain lion hunting in California again. And we've received a number of questions about this over the last, well, actually for some time now. And the second question, which oftentimes is asked almost in the same breath, is when do we allow hunting again for bears with dogs? And unfortunately, that answer is the same. It's a legislative change that is required before we're able to do that again.
Standing. So, Brandon, this one's for you, and I think you've covered some of these in your presentation, but I don't think it would hurt a bit to revisit a few of these. So, how many cases of chronic wasting disease have been verified, and from where? What zones?
Yeah, thanks for that question. This is a good one to harp on for sure. We have only detected 2 animals that were CWD positive. One from Madera County and zone D7, and that was a adult male that was found dead and of unknown causes, and not hunter harvested. And the second one was from the Bishop area, again, an adult male. This one died from a vehicle strike. That one, because of the unrefined geographic data that we have for that one, all we have for that one was Bishop area. It's right at the confluence of X9A, X9B, and X9C. So again, applying a cautious principle to this, my assumption is that there is CWD in all 3 of those zones, but we have not confirmed it in all 3 of those zones.
Okay, let's bounce back to Brian. And this has a kind of a comment, and then the question is at the last. As a former logger, I used to notice how logged areas would become deer magnets in a year or 2 after the harvest as feeding opportunities increased in these areas. Modern logging practices have companies dumping gallons of poison on logged areas. This can't be good for any species. Is there anything being done to discourage this practice? Can you answer that in part, Brian?
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to comment and answer as best I can. Yeah, I think I've seen this recently in some of the D zones in the Keldor fire footprint. Where some logging company property abuts, the national forest, and you can see it's like night and day. One is like a desert, and the other is, prime forage habitat for deer. So I think it leaves us with 2 options. One is to try to instill more regulations to influence those companies and whoever else is doing these practices, or we can try to work with them and try to find incentives to limit the use of herbicides. So I don't know. We need to kind of decide whether, if it were me, I would like to go the carrot route as opposed to the stick route, and see if we can work with those landowners to incentivize improving deer habitat.
Well said. And as a game warden, I would echo that wholeheartedly. The carrot route is way better. Let's bounce back to you, Brandon, and let's talk a little bit about wildfires and CWD. So the question is, what wildfire areas and/or geographic areas have confirmed CWD?
Well, so the geographic area is really that Yosemite Lakes Park area, and probably 5 to 10 mile radius around that would be a safe buffer zone, and that's where we detected the one on the west slope in Madera County, D7, and then the Bishop area again on the east slope, Inyo County, the X9A, B, C. Certainly that western slope is wildfire area, and wildfire is a burgeoning area of interest for CWD researchers and managers. There's some indication that wildfire might decrease environmental prion loads or contamination, which could be useful for decreasing exposure and management. There's zero evidence really to say how effective that is or how important it might be. But I would expect there to be significant research done on that in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, Brian, go ahead and look through the Q&A. You're off the hook for right now, brother, but I do have some more follow-up questions for Brandon. I have read an article alleging that CWD might have crossed the species barrier into humans. Is there any truth to this?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is probably referencing an article published in a human medical journal. I think the best way to put it is there was zero evidence or connection in that article. The connection was circumstantial at best, and I'm a little disappointed that it was published because it highlights that we don't really know, which I think is good, but it also is a little bit not salacious, but it's a little bit eye-catching, and it probably doesn't need to be. So the bottom line is there's zero evidence currently that CWD can or has crossed over into people. Zero evidence. And
Yep.
until that changes, that's going to be the case. But we do recommend getting animals tested and making a decision whether you're comfortable eating a positive animal or not. Our recommendation is not.
Got it. So Brandon, are there any home tests for CWD available? And if not, is there any effort to make them available?
Boy, I wish there were. So CWD is an infectious protein, and it is very different as an infectious agent than bacteria, viruses, fungus, stuff that we've been dealing with for hundreds of years. We've only known about this for probably about 50. And there's a lot of hurdles to developing accurate diagnostic tests. There's a lot of interest in developing more accurate and more rapid diagnostic tests, but those haven't really borne fruit yet. And a home test is unlikely to be available anytime soon, or at least an approved home test. I'm sure there are people trying to sell home tests. I would not trust them.
Well said. So we'll give you a little bit of a break, Brandon, but gear up. We're going to come back to you. Brian, I've got a question for you. As the statewide deer coordinator, what's your favorite part of your job? What do you enjoy doing the very most?
Yeah, that would definitely be getting out in the field and checking out this beautiful state. It's been fantastic. I've been down in the San Bernardino Mountains, and then the next month I'm up in X3B doing stuff. And it's also just been great to get to know all of the different biologists around the state and learning all their local knowledge. There's such a great resource for us here in headquarters. So yeah.
Yeah, and kind of a personal note to you, Brian, I'm thankful that you're a hunter. I'm thankful that you have a passion for deer hunting, and you enjoy hunting deer just like so many of our viewers. So let's go back to Brandon. I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this or not, but give it a shot. What's the impact of CWD on domestic livestock? Any evidence that it does affect domestic livestock, Brandon?
Yeah, that's not a bad question at all. And I'm going to use this question to answer another question I saw in the Q&A. So domestic livestock, there's a whole lot of different domestic livestock out there. And in states that allow captive cervid industry, that could be considered domestic livestock. So cervids, so deer, elk, that includes fallow deer, that includes some of the other, like axis deer and some of the other exotic deer that are sometimes in the captive industry. Most of those I would consider susceptible. So the family Cervidae, the deer and elk, I would consider most animals in that family susceptible. There's some evidence that fallow deer may not be, but I'm waiting for that to be kind of tested a little bit more before I'm very before I'm sure about that one. The other side of the domestic livestock, so sheep, goats, cattle, cattle not susceptible naturally to chronic wasting disease. Sheep have been shown to be susceptible in the lab to chronic wasting disease. And a lot of that work was done to test whether it was likely or possible for CWD to be a species jump from sheep scrapie to deer. So yeah, in the lab, we can give it back to sheep. There's, again, one lab study that showed that they can give it to pigs as well, but it's really hard to give it to pigs. So in general, not in the natural course of things, I would say livestock are not susceptible, at least our domestic and non-exotic deer.
Okay. So here's kind of an old school question about brain tanning a hide with a deer infected with CWD. So are you familiar with brain tanning, Brandon? And if so, would you recommend a hunter doing that has CWD?
I am familiar with brain tanning, and with CWD on the landscape in North America, I would not recommend brain tanning anything. The infectious prions are extremely robust, and if that animal is positive, you'd just be basically painting prions on the back of your hide, and that I can't advise that. I would definitely find other avenues for tanning.
Got it. So is it safe to consume deer that have been affected by CWD?
Yeah, that there's no evidence that it's not safe.
Mhm.
My approach is I'm extremely cautious when it comes to it. I won't feed it to my kids, so I won't consume it myself, and that's kind of how I approach it. I don't want to be patient zero, and I don't want my kids to be patient zero, but there is zero evidence. I know many people that have consumed CWD or meat from CWD positive animals. And so I really think it's up to the hunter to decide whether they're comfortable doing it. CDC and World Health Organization recommend not doing it.
This is a really good question. On the Q&A, there's one that talks about if you come across a dead deer, what information do you need to locate the carcass? I think maybe the question is, what do you do about that? Should you turn that in? Should you notify the department? What's your suggestion on that, Brandon?
You can definitely notify the department through that online mortality reporting system.
Mhm.
I will be frank, we don't have the resources, nor really the need to investigate every single one of those. There's the option to upload a GPS point. There's the option to upload a picture. Pictures speak 1,000 words in my business. Every biologist I've ever worked with can tell you that the first thing I ask is, can you send me a picture? And so that's helpful. most of the time, especially in California's climate, especially when people are out on the landscape in California's climate, once something is found dead in the environment and it's reported and it gets to anybody in the field that can respond, it's been a few days, and by that time, it's not a very valuable diagnostic sample.
So Brandon, we'll keep on firing off at you. In the presentation, we've discussed after CDFW has been, or CW, chronic wasting disease has been detected. Has any other state found any preventative steps which can be taken?
That's a really good question. Preventive steps are really been focused on cutting out the movement of infectious materials. And that's what we've focused on. That's what other states have focused on. It's hard to say whether anybody's really been effective at preventing it, at least in North America. I think that map I showed is probably more the tip of the iceberg than the entire iceberg. And that's just it. It's just that it's really hard to detect, and once you detect it, it's probably been there for a while, and it's in more animals, and prevention is really, really, really hard.
Yeah. So I've seen a reoccurring question about bears, predators. Is there any evidence that they've tested positive for CWD? And I guess the second part of this question is, do we know why some animals, such as antelope, do not appear to get CWD, and then others like elk and deer do?
Yeah, again, really good questions. I will try not to bore people with a technical answer. The first part, the carnivore stuff, there's no evidence that any carnivores or scavengers or anything like that have contracted CWD from consuming CWD positive animals. A study in Colorado was basically just feeding some captive lions CWD meat for years and years and years and years and years and years. There's some evidence that suggests that the number of infectious particles that get pooped out by those carnivores and scavengers decreases. So that might actually be a good thing. And I suspect that carnivores probably play an important role at keeping the CWD prevalence down in populations where the top predators do exist. So I think there is a role there. The reason why some species are susceptible to CWD and some species are not susceptible to CWD has to do with that protein. And the protein, the infectious protein, is a misformed version of a normal protein that's in all mammals, but it's slightly different between species. And so it's similar enough in most cervid members of the cervid family, the deer and elk family, that most of those members are probably susceptible to CWD, but it's different enough between CWD and those members and species outside of the cervid family. So antelope lives off in their own family by themselves. They are not a cervid, they're not related. And so that they're not susceptible. Similar to humans, there's evidence that we're not susceptible, and potentially we won't be susceptible. So that's where the species barrier comes in. It's almost like a lock and key. If the infectious protein can't attach to the normal protein, it can't tell it to go bad. And that's why it won't transmit.
So there's a question that came in about, does your team consume venison that is tested negative for CWD? And I can speak for myself. I do. In fact, we just harvested elk in Nevada, and we're eating that. So I guess that would be a personal decision. But how about you guys? If your venison tested negative for CWD, would you consume it? What do you think, Brian?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
How about you, Brandon?
Yeah, I prefer elk, so I would certainly be consuming elk. And
Yes.
most of my elk were harvested out of Wyoming and areas that CWD was present.
So just a shout out to our audience participants. It's just awesome questions that are going to come in, that are keep coming in and flowing in. Right now there's 36. So we're not going to be able to get to every one of these questions tonight. But like I said in the preface to this webinar, Zoom does a really cool thing and it records all the questions. And so we will get back to you in writing if we have not addressed your question live tonight or in writing. So I guess we'll do one more question and then we'll kind of close out the webinar. And that is, and I can address this one. Will game wardens test in the field? And so far, I haven't received any information from the law enforcement division that we're going to be doing testing in the field. That might change in the near future, but for right now, the answer to that is no. And lastly, last question, it'll be for you. And it might not be an easy one to answer, Brandon. Is there any idea how CWD arrived in California?
Yeah, and we have lots of possible routes that it came in. It's unlikely that we're ever going to know how it got here or when it got here. So likely routes that it got here were probably the most likely route it got here at this point was in the back of someone's truck, 4 tires driving across the country. It could have walked across. It could be a spontaneously developing thing, and detecting it is just ridiculously difficult. I think based on 50 years of work on CWD, not that I've done, but that others have done, we know that it has. Well, we're pretty sure it's traveled long distances in trucks, whether through live animal movement or harvested animal movement, and so that's a lot of what state import movement regulations are focused on. So that seems, considering Nevada and Oregon and Arizona haven't detected it yet, that seems quite plausible.
Well said. So we're going to go ahead and close the webinar now. I just want to say thank you so much, Brandon and Brian. Thank you for coming on tonight. Thank you for serving the hunting community the way you have and the way that you will continue. And just want to reiterate something that Brian and Brandon said throughout the course of the webinar, and that is the cooperation. We need hunters to cooperate with the department, and we want to be good allies with hunters. And in order to stop the spread of CWD, we need hunter input, we need data, and we want to work with you. So that being said, we're going to close out the webinar. Thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, everyone.